What happens when a ruthless gang targets an aging black veteran, only to discover his forgotten past holds more power than they expected? Watch as David Carter faces his former comrade, Jack Evans, and uncovers a dark conspiracy threatening his town. David Harris, a retired Army veteran, sat in his usual booth at Daisy's Cafe. At 68, his life had become a routine, the town's quiet rhythm wrapping around him like a protective cocoon. The low hum of chatter and the clink of coffee mugs were his background music, while the morning sun cast its soft light through the large windows. Despite his years, David's sharp gaze had yet to dull. He took a sip from his coffee mug, savoring the warmth, before glancing out the window. The peaceful streets of Millers Creek, North Carolina, were as calm as ever. This town had been his sanctuary, a place to escape the shadows of his military past. Here, David had built a life far from the battles and the pain, living as just another town fixture. Grace, the cafe's owner, appeared beside him, offering a familiar smile. "Refill, Mr. Harris?" Her voice was warm, the kind that made regulars feel like family. "Why not?" David replied, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Keeps me young." Grace laughed as she refilled his cup. "You're something else, you know?" She hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to the window. "Have you noticed those guys outside?" David followed her gaze. 4 men leaned against the cafe's brick exterior, their presence sharp and territorial. They were out of place in this sleepy town, dressed in leather jackets and sporting tattoos that spoke of trouble. He didn't respond right away, studying them with the calm detachment of someone who'd seen worse. Grace's concern was palpable, and she added, "I've heard things about them. I don't like it." David took another sip, his eyes never leaving the men. "Don't worry about me, Grace. I've dealt with worse." She frowned but didn't push further. She turned and walked away, her concern still lingering in the air. David's thoughts shifted. He'd been around long enough to know when trouble was brewing, but for now he stayed put, watching the men with quiet scrutiny. The bell above the door jingled and the group of men walked in, their boots thudding against the floor, their presence suddenly larger than life. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a sneer, scanned the room before his eyes landed on David. A grin stretched across his face. "Well, well," the man said, strolling toward David's booth, his voice mocking. "Looks like the old guard's still kicking." David didn't flinch. He met the man's eyes with a calm, unwavering gaze, as if waiting for the moment to pass. The man's grin faltered briefly, but he quickly recovered. "Mind if we join you?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. David leaned back, setting his coffee cup down. "Depends. Can you handle sitting quietly?" The leader's smirk deepened, but he slid into the booth across from David without waiting for an answer. His cronies lingered near the counter, eyes scanning the room like predators. The air in the cafe shifted, tension creeping in. People went quiet, glancing nervously at the intruders. "You don't get it, old man," the leader, Mike, said, leaning forward with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "There's places for people like you, and this ain't one of them." David remained composed. "Didn't know there were rules for sitting in a cafe," he replied calmly. Mike's cronies laughed, the sound hollow. Paul, a wiry man with a patchy beard, barked a laugh. "Oh, there are rules. First rule, know your place. Second rule, don't think you're welcome when you're not," he sneered, glancing at David's hands. "You really think anyone here gives a damn about some old black vet?" David didn't react. He simply sat back, his eyes steady. Grace, watching from behind the counter, slammed her hands down. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't talk to him like that in my cafe." Mike turned toward her, his smirk widening. "Your cafe?" he mocked. "This whole town's ours. You think anyone here is going to stand up for you? For him?" He gestured toward David with a flick of his hand. "I do," Grace said, though her voice wavered. "Now leave." Mike ignored her, focusing on David. "Tell me, old man, what's it like thinking you fought for something real? Thinking you mattered?" He chuckled cruelly. "You didn't. Not here. Not anywhere." David's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Funny. You seem to care an awful lot about me sitting here." Mike's grin faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. Care? Nah, we just don't like seeing people like you getting comfortable where you're not wanted. David took another sip of coffee, the clink of the ceramic mug striking the table louder than it should have been. Funny you seem to care, he repeated evenly. Mike stood abruptly, towering over David. We'll fix that, he muttered. Come on, boys. The group turned and walked toward the door, but as they reached it, Mike glanced back over his shoulder. Hey, old man, if you're feeling brave, maybe come see us outside. Let's see if you still have any fight left in you. David didn't respond. He simply stood up, brushing the wrinkles from his sleeve as he turned to walk toward the door. Grace's worried gaze met his, but David raised a hand to silence her. I'll be right back, he said, his voice low and steady, his purpose already set. The heat of the midday sun hit his face as David stepped outside. Across the street, the gang was waiting for him, laughing and mocking. But David wasn't worried. This was more than just a confrontation. It was personal. The tattoo on his forearm, the one that marked him as part of something greater than this small-town scum, was a symbol of a past he hadn't expected to revisit. But now it had come back. The ghost of Jack Evans, his former comrade, was haunting him. Jack was the one behind this gang, leading them with the same twisted ideals that had once consumed him. David narrowed his eyes, the pieces falling into place. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. David stepped outside into the harsh midday sun. The heat from the pavement burned through his boots, but his focus was entirely on the men across the street. They were waiting for him in the alley, their laughter echoing through the still air. Mike and his gang had their backs to the sunlight, casting long shadows on the ground as they leaned casually against the brick wall. They were waiting for David to make his move. David's steps were slow but deliberate as he crossed the street. His mind was calm, steady, as always. He'd faced far worse in his life than a group of punks trying to prove their dominance in a small town. But there was something about these men that made the situation more than just a physical confrontation. They weren't just disrespecting him. They were disrespecting everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed. As he neared the alleyway, the men turned to face him. Mike, the leader, stepped forward first, his grin wide and mocking. Well, looks like the old man found his courage, he drawled, looking David up and down as if he were sizing up a piece of meat. David stopped a few feet away, his posture still relaxed but his eyes sharp. Thought I'd come out here and hear the rest of your story, he said, his voice low and steady, just loud enough to be heard over the wind that had picked up in the street. What story? Mike sneered. We already told you everything you need to know. You don't belong here, old man. You're just another relic from a time that doesn't matter anymore. David didn't flinch. Seems to me like you've got a lot of free time for someone who's trying to make a point. You sure you don't have somewhere else to be? Mike's smile faltered for just a moment before it returned, this time more forceful, as if trying to cover up his growing discomfort. We're here to clean up the town. Take it back from the filth. He gestured to David with a broad sweep of his arm, as if David were just another part of that filth. And you're a part of the problem. Always have been. David's eyes narrowed. You're real proud of yourself, huh? He asked, his voice still level. Tell me, Mike, what exactly are you cleaning up? Who's the real filth here? Paul, one of Mike's cronies, laughed from the side. He was the wiry one, his face unshaven, and his eyes darted between David and Mike. It's funny, really, Paul sneered. You think you matter. You think anyone here cares what you did. Newsflash, buddy, no one does. They just want you gone. You're a relic. David stood tall, his arms crossed, his gaze unblinking. He wasn't here for taunts or name-calling. He wasn't even here to fight, at least not yet. Funny, he said, his voice almost a whisper. You're sure talking a lot for someone who's never earned the right to be in those ranks. The silence that followed was sharp, filled with the tension of unspoken history. Mike's grin faltered, his expression darkening. He took a step closer to David, his voice lowering. You think that's funny, old man? Mike's eyes were cold now, and his tone had shifted, no longer playful, but dangerous. You think I care what you did in the military? You think any of that matters to me? David didn't answer. He didn't need to. Paul took a step forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "I'll tell you what matters," he said, his voice filled with venom. "You think you fought for something real, huh? A country that doesn't care about you? They just use you, throw you in, and forget about you once you're done. You're nothing. Nothing but another token they use to fill a quota." The words stung, but David remained unfazed. He'd heard worse during his time in the service. He'd faced enemies on foreign soil who were far more brutal than these men ever could be. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying weight. "That it's all about a quota? About fitting some mold?" Paul stepped closer, his breath hot against David's face. "You spent your life thinking you mattered, but you don't. You never did. Not here. Not anymore." David's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "Funny," he said, his gaze never leaving Paul's. "You seem to care a lot about what I've done. If I'm such a joke, why are you so obsessed with me?" Mike's expression hardened. He stepped forward, pushing Paul aside. "You're still here thinking you've got a place, but you don't. You never will. And I'll make sure of that." David could feel the tension crackling in the air. He could almost taste it, the fear and anger coiling within these men. They were trying to provoke him, trying to get him to react. But David knew better. He wasn't going to fall into their trap. "Go home," David said quietly. "You're not welcome here." Mike's face twisted with rage. He was about to speak, but Paul stepped in, his voice sharp. "Let's just finish this. The old man's not worth the trouble." David stood his ground, unfazed. "You don't get it. You've never been worth the trouble. Not in my book." The wind picked up, sending dust swirling around them. For a moment, all was still. Then Mike took a step back, his grin returning. "You've got a smart mouth, old man. I'll give you that. But don't think it'll save you." Mike turned, nodding to his crew. "Come on, boys," he called, waving them away. "Let's go. The war hero can have his coffee." David stood there, watching them go. His heart was calm, but his mind was racing. He knew this wasn't over. These men weren't just some local thugs. They were part of something darker, something he wasn't ready to face just yet. He turned back toward the cafe, his thoughts heavy. Grace was watching from the window, her face pale with concern. David gave her a brief nod as he walked back inside. This fight was just beginning. David stepped back into the cafe, his boots scraping softly against the wooden floor as the door swung shut behind him. Grace was standing behind the counter, her hands still trembling slightly as she wiped them on her apron. Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something that David couldn't quite place. "Are you all right?" Grace asked softly, her voice tinged with worry. "What did they want?" David gave her a small, reassuring smile as he slid into his usual booth. "It's nothing. They'll be gone soon enough." Grace wasn't convinced, though. She walked over to his booth, hesitating for a moment before sitting across from him. Her brow furrowed as she studied his face. "David, those men, they're dangerous. They've been hanging around here too much lately, and I don't like it." David sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. His mind was still focused on the encounter outside, but he knew Grace was right. These men weren't just looking for trouble. They were on a mission that had now crossed paths with him, and that wasn't something he could just walk away from. "Grace, I've seen worse," David said, his voice calm, but his eyes distant. "This town's small. It feels safe. But trust me, people like that, they don't care about that. They want control." Grace shook her head. "What do they want from you? You don't seem like someone they can push around." David's eyes darkened for a moment, a fleeting shadow passing across his face. The old wound, the one he tried so hard to ignore, was starting to crack open. It had been years since he'd thought about it, years since he'd let the memories of the men he fought with and the missions he carried out consume him. "They don't want anything from me," David said quietly, his voice suddenly heavy with a weight Grace wasn't sure she could fully understand. "But they're trying to push a bigger agenda. It's bigger than just a few guys trying to make trouble in a cafe." Grace stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening. "What do you mean?" David leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. His eyes focused on the window, though he wasn't really seeing anything outside. "You don't know this, but I wasn't always here. I wasn't always the man you see sitting in your cafe, drinking coffee every day. Grace tilted her head slightly, a sense of curiosity mixed with concern crossing her features. I know you were in the army, but what happened after? David's gaze drifted to the window again, his mind pulling him back in time. I served with a man named Jack Evans. We were in the same unit, Special Forces, part of a group we called the Ghosts. We were good at what we did. Too good, maybe. Grace's brow furrowed as she listened. She had never asked much about David's military past. He had never seemed eager to share it, but now, seeing the faraway look in his eyes, she understood. There was something about these men outside, something about them that was far too familiar. David continued, his voice quieter now. Jack and I were close. We fought side by side, bled side by side. But Jack, he changed. He always had ideas about strength, about loyalty, but they started to get twisted. We didn't see eye to eye, and eventually he started pulling away from the rest of us. I tried to keep him grounded, but it didn't work. He paused, his jaw tightening as the memories came rushing back. The days spent in foreign lands, the blood spilled, the men who never came home. Jack went rogue. He left the military and formed a group, a gang, led by his twisted ideals. They claimed to be cleaning up the world, but all they're doing is spreading hate. I knew it then, but I didn't stop him. And now he's back, and he's not alone. Grace could see the pain in David's eyes, the regret. She had known he'd seen things, done things that had left their mark on him. But hearing it out loud made her realize just how deep those scars went. You think he's leading them? Grace asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his expression darkening. I know he is. That's why they're so obsessed with me. They see me as a threat, someone who knows the man behind the mask, a man they once called a brother. Grace reached out, her hand resting gently on his. David, you can't carry that burden alone. You have to tell someone. If Jack's behind this, it's more than just a gang causing trouble. You're not in the field anymore. They could hurt you, or worse, hurt the town. David's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew she was right, but the weight of his past, the loyalty he once had for Jack, made it harder to accept. I have to handle this myself. Jack's not just another criminal. He's a ghost from my past, and I won't let him drag anyone else into the mess he's made. Grace squeezed his hand, but her concern didn't fade. Just promise me you'll be careful. David gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'll be fine, Grace. I've faced worse. But even as he said it, he knew there was something different about this fight. This time, the stakes weren't just his own life on the line. They were everyone's. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. I need to find out where they're hiding. If they're targeting this town, I need to stop them before it goes too far. Grace nodded, worry still etched across her face. If you need anything, I'm here. You don't have to do this alone. David paused at the door, turning to glance back at her. Thanks, Grace. I'll let you know if I need anything. He stepped out into the street, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. As he walked away from the cafe, the sound of the wind carrying the distant hum of the town, he knew that this wasn't just about confronting a gang. This was about confronting his own past, the ghost that haunted him, and the man he had once called a brother. And this time, he was determined not to let that ghost win. David walked down the quiet streets of Miller's Creek, his boots thudding softly against the pavement as his mind raced. He had a plan, he always did, but the weight of what lay ahead felt heavier than usual. Jack Evans wasn't just some thug hiding in the shadows. He was a ghost from David's past, a man he once trusted with his life. Now that man had turned into the kind of leader who twisted ideals into something dark, something dangerous. As David passed through the town center, he found himself scanning every face, every corner, as though he might spot something out of place. Miller's Creek was small, too small to be hiding something so sinister. But Jack had a way of working in the shadows, always pulling the strings without anyone noticing. David knew that if he didn't act quickly, the town would pay the price. He didn't go to the police. He couldn't. They didn't have the experience to deal with something like this, not with Jack leading the charge. The local sheriff, an old friend of David's, had always been a decent man, but he was no soldier. He didn't know how to track a ghost, especially not one who had been in David's position once before. Jack knew how to cover his tracks, how to leave no trace. David's thoughts turned to Grace. She had no idea what kind of danger she was in, or what kind of man Jack had become. The last thing David wanted was for her to get caught in the crossfire. She was too kind, too innocent. But even she had begun to notice the change in the air, the increasing presence of Mike and his gang, the simmering tension in the town that made people uneasy. As he reached the edge of town, David spotted the old warehouse by the train tracks. It had been abandoned for years, a crumbling shell of what it once was, the rusted metal sides barely holding together. It was the perfect place for Jack's operation to hide, out of sight, out of mind. No one would think to look there. David crouched down behind a stack of discarded crates just outside the warehouse, peering through the gaps. The shadows inside seemed to be moving. His instincts told him that Jack was here. This was his base of operations. David's breath was steady, his every sense honed as he surveyed the area. The group of men who had confronted him in the cafe were gathered around a folding table, maps and papers scattered across it. The flickering light from a single bulb above them cast long shadows on the walls. David could hear the faint murmur of their voices, though he couldn't make out the words. He needed to get closer, to hear what they were planning. Slowly he crept forward, his boots barely making a sound on the gravel. The night was still, too still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. He moved toward the partially open window, his body tense as he got a glimpse of the room inside. He could see the men now, Mike, Paul, and the others, all huddled around the table, with Jack sitting at the head. His presence commanded the room. David's heart skipped a beat when he saw Jack. It was like staring at a ghost from another lifetime, the face of a man he'd once called a friend. Jack's eyes were cold, hard, nothing like the man David had known, the man who had fought beside him, the man who had shared his burdens. That man was gone. In his place was a stranger, a man who had embraced the darkness, twisted the loyalty they had once shared into something ugly. The men were planning something. David could see the way they were moving the map, marking locations with red circles, talking about burning homes and businesses. It was as if they had decided to take control of the town by force, using terror to push people into submission. Jack was orchestrating it all, leading them down a path of destruction. David's jaw tightened as he watched them. He had to act fast. If they were planning to start their attacks tonight, he had no time to waste. He needed to gather more information, find out where they were targeting, and stop them before they could escalate. He moved silently toward the back of the warehouse, finding a narrow side door. It was rusted, old, but with a little force, David managed to pry it open. The hinges groaned under his weight, but the sound was muffled by the constant hum of voices inside. David slipped inside, his movements practiced and quiet. The warehouse was dark, the air thick with the smell of oil and stale beer. He moved through the cluttered space, his eyes darting from one pile of crates to another as he made his way closer to the table. He had to get the map. Their targets were on it, and it was the key to stopping this before it went too far. As he approached the table, he heard one of the men's voices grow louder, and he froze. His heart raced in his chest as he hid behind a stack of crates, watching the men talk. They were discussing their plan to hit homes on the outskirts of town. Jack had them marked on the map, homes he wanted to burn, businesses he wanted to destroy. His grip on the map tightened, and David's thoughts raced. They were going to make the town feel their wrath. It was more organized than he had anticipated. They weren't just random acts of violence. They were targeting specific people. David scanned the names and addresses scribbled on the paper, committing them to memory. He knew he had to get this information to the authorities, but first he had to get out of here undetected. He waited as one of the men went to the door, muttering something under his breath. David moved quickly, slipping through a narrow gap at the back of the room and making his way toward the exit. His movements were swift and calculated, each step bringing him closer to his goal. As he reached the door, he paused, hearing footsteps behind him. He froze, pressing himself against the cold metal wall. The last thing he needed was to be caught now. The door creaked open, and one of the men stepped outside. David held his breath, waiting for the man to pass. The seconds felt like hours as he watched the figure disappear into the night. Once he was sure the coast was clear, David moved quickly, slipping out the back door and disappearing into the shadows of the night. His mind was racing. He had the information he needed, and now it was time to put his plan into motion. The police had to be notified. Jack and his gang were too dangerous to be left unchecked. But David knew this fight wasn't just about stopping a group of criminals. It was about confronting a man he once called a brother, a man who had gone rogue, and now David had to face him again. This time there would be no turning back. David moved through the streets of Miller's Creek like a shadow. His mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand, but his heart was heavier than it had been in years. He had the names, the locations, the plan, everything he needed to put an end to Jack Evans' reign of terror. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to face something far darker than he had anticipated. He reached the small police station on the edge of town. It was a modest building, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest calls were usually about lost pets or minor traffic incidents. But tonight, it was about to handle something far more serious. David walked through the door, the bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the station was quiet, too quiet. A few officers were sitting at desks, their heads bent over paperwork, and the faint sound of a television playing in the back corner filled the silence. One officer, a young man named Officer Samuels, glanced up as David entered. His expression shifted from boredom to recognition as he saw the older man approach. David had been in and out of the station plenty of times over the years, though he hadn't asked for help until now. "Mr. Harris," Samuel said, standing up and offering a polite nod. "What can we do for you?" David didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need to talk to Sheriff Carter." Samuels looked hesitant, glancing over his shoulder at the back office. "He's in a meeting with some of the other officers. It's about a rash of burglaries over on the north side, but you can wait." David shook his head. "No time for that. This is bigger than just burglaries. We've got a problem in this town, and it's not just petty crime." He lowered his voice, his gaze steady. "I need to show him something." Samuels hesitated but nodded, motioning for David to follow. As they moved toward the back office, David felt a tightness in his chest. He'd seen countless law enforcement officials over the years, but tonight, he wasn't just dealing with small-town officers. He was dealing with a network of violence, with Jack at the center of it all. The door to Sheriff Carter's office was slightly ajar, and David didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Sheriff Carter, a grizzled man in his mid-50s with a salt and pepper beard, was sitting at his desk, looking over a stack of reports. He looked up as David entered, his tired eyes narrowing in recognition. "David," Sheriff Carter said, his voice low but warm, "what brings you in tonight?" David didn't waste any time. "I've got intel on the gang running through this town. Jack Evans is behind it all." Sheriff Carter's expression didn't change at first, but the room seemed to grow heavier as David spoke. "Jack Evans?" Carter repeated, the name clearly striking a nerve. "I know that name. He's from your unit, right?" David nodded. "We served together, but he's not the man he used to be. He's turned into something monstrous." Carter stood up slowly, his eyes hardening. "What's he doing here?" David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the map, the one he had stolen from the warehouse earlier. He laid it on the sheriff's desk, pointing to the marked locations. "This is where they're hitting. Homes, businesses, places they've decided they want to take back. They're starting tonight. If we don't stop them, it'll get worse." Carter leaned over the desk, studying the map carefully. His eyes flicked between the addresses, the anger in his face building. "These are specific locations, families. You're saying they're targeting people?" David nodded grimly. "They want to make an example of anyone who doesn't fit their version of purity. It's not just about intimidation. It's about erasing people they see as inferior." The sheriff slammed his hand down on the desk, his knuckles white. "We can't let that happen. Not in my town. Not with you here." David took a deep breath. "It's not enough to just show them this map, Sheriff. We need to act fast. If we wait for the authorities to organize, we'll be too late." Sheriff Carter frowned. "You're not suggesting we handle this ourselves, are you?" David met his gaze, his voice steady. "This is bigger than just police work. Jack knows how to stay under the radar, how to strike quickly. He's used to men like us. He knows how to operate without leaving evidence. This isn't just a gang, it's an army, and they're waiting for the right moment to strike. Carter ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. What do you want me to do, David? I can't just throw a bunch of officers at a problem like this without backup. This could escalate in a heartbeat. David stepped forward, the weight of years of experience showing in his posture. I'm going after him. You and your men don't have the resources for this fight, but I do. If you want to stop him, you'll need to trust me. I know Jack better than anyone, and I know what it's going to take to put an end to this. Carter stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. You're serious? David nodded. I don't want to see anyone else hurt, but if I don't stop him, people will die. The sheriff hesitated again, then seemed to come to a decision. All right, I'll make sure the town's covered, but you'd better not do this alone. David's face softened slightly. I never planned to, but I can't wait for anyone else to act. Jack's too dangerous. He turned to leave the office, but Sheriff Carter called out to him. David, be careful. David paused for a moment, his hand on the door. I will. I have to stop this. For everyone. David left the police station with a sense of urgency. Sheriff Carter had given him the green light, but David knew he couldn't rely on the sheriff's limited resources. It was up to him now. Jack Evans and his gang had made their intentions clear, and if David didn't stop them tonight, the town would be forever changed. The clock was ticking. David headed for the outskirts of town. The warehouse where Jack was hiding out was still fresh in his mind, the layout of the building imprinted on his brain after his brief reconnaissance earlier. He knew the area well. It had been a frequent stop during his time in the service, a place where the shadows were thick and anything could happen. Tonight, it was no different. The air felt thick with tension, and David could sense the chaos brewing just beneath the surface. As he walked, the weight of the map he'd taken from the warehouse burned in his pocket. He had memorized the names and locations on it, but there was something else lurking in the back of his mind. Jack wasn't just a man he had fought beside, he was a part of something far bigger now. And David knew that, once the town had fallen, Jack would move on to something more dangerous. He couldn't let that happen, not while he still had a chance to stop it. The sound of footsteps behind him made David pause. He turned around to see Grace hurrying toward him. Her face was a mix of concern and determination, and the sight of her brought an unexpected pang in his chest. He had been trying to keep her safe, but she wasn't the type to sit idly by while trouble brewed. David, wait! Grace called out, breathless from running. I'm coming with you. David shook his head, his jaw tight. No, Grace, it's too dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with. She stood her ground, her eyes burning with resolve. I've been around long enough to know when something's wrong. I'm not letting you do this alone. David exhaled slowly, frustration creeping into his voice. This isn't something you can help with. Jack's dangerous. He's not just another thug. Grace stepped forward, her expression unwavering. I know what he is, David, but I'm not going to sit here while you risk your life. Not again. David hesitated. He had been fighting battles for most of his life, but this one was personal. It wasn't just about stopping a gang from terrorizing the town. It was about stopping Jack, a man he had once trusted, a man who had betrayed everything David believed in. Grace, I'm not asking you to understand, he said softly, but I can't have you in the middle of this. It's not just about you or me anymore. It's about the whole damn town. Grace's expression softened slightly, but she didn't step back. I understand more than you think, and I'm not going to let you walk into that warehouse alone. You're not going to make it by yourself. David felt a rush of emotion that he hadn't expected. He had spent so long carrying the weight of his past, thinking he had to face everything alone. But here was Grace, standing beside him, offering her support even when he had nothing left to give. He gave her a long, searching look, his mind weighing the risks. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly in defeat. Fine, but you stay close, and you do exactly what I say. Understand? Grace nodded, her eyes fierce. I can handle myself. David didn't argue. Together, they headed for the warehouse, their footsteps quickening as they neared the building. The air was thick with tension, and the night felt oppressive. The hum of distant traffic was barely audible, swallowed by the overwhelming quiet of the warehouse district. The building loomed ahead, its metal walls rusted and decaying, and the faint glow of light leaking from cracks in the structure told David everything he needed to know. Jack was inside, and his men were preparing for their attack. David's hand went to the knife tucked in his boot, his fingers brushing the cool steel. He'd fought alongside men with weapons, and he knew how to move in the shadows. But this was different. Jack knew how to use fear to his advantage, how to manipulate people into following him, even when they had no idea what they were truly fighting for. David crouched down beside a pile of old crates just outside the warehouse, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Grace knelt beside him, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline that was clearly pumping through her veins. "We need to get in there without being seen," David whispered, his voice low but urgent. "Jack and his crew are all over the place. If we're lucky, we can catch them off guard." Grace nodded, her fingers flexing at her sides, as if ready to take action. "I'm with you." David took one last glance around, then led the way toward the back of the warehouse. The building was poorly lit, the shadows deepening as they moved closer to their objective. They passed by windows that had long ago been covered with old plywood, the remnants of years of neglect. David knew that Jack had chosen this place for a reason. It was out of sight, tucked away from the rest of the town. But it was also vulnerable, and that was the weakness David planned to exploit. As they reached the back door, David motioned for Grace to stay low. He checked the handle, finding it unlocked, and carefully nudged the door open. The hinges creaked softly, but it was the only sound in the otherwise still night. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates, discarded furniture, and broken machinery. The air was thick with the smell of oil and stale beer, and the dim light from a few bare bulbs cast eerie shadows across the room. David and Grace moved through the space, sticking close to the walls, their footsteps light. They could hear voices ahead, low, murmuring, the sound of people discussing their plans. The faint outline of figures moved in the shadows, and David's heart began to race. Jack was here, somewhere in this room, surrounded by his loyal followers. The time to act was now. They rounded a corner and found themselves face to face with a group of men gathered around a table, maps and papers spread out in front of them. Jack was sitting at the head of the table, his cold eyes scanning the room, his mouth twisted into a sneer. He looked up as David and Grace stepped into view, his expression darkening. "Well, well," Jack said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "Look who decided to show up." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, his gaze unwavering. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. And this time, he wasn't walking away. The air inside the warehouse felt dense with tension as Jack Evans slowly rose from his seat. His men shifted uneasily around the table, their eyes flicking between David and Grace. David could feel the weight of their gaze, but he kept his posture steady, his eyes locked on Jack. "Well, well," Jack repeated, his voice dripping with malice. "The old ghost from my past come to pay me a visit. And you brought company." He glanced at Grace, who stood beside David, her jaw set in determination. "You always did have a thing for saving the helpless." David didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. He knew Jack's words were just attempts to weaken his resolve, to provoke him. But this wasn't just a war of words. This was about righting a betrayal, ending the suffering Jack had brought to so many. "You've crossed a line, Jack," David said, his voice steady but sharp. "What you're doing here, it's not about loyalty or strength, it's about hate. And I'm not going to let you destroy this town." Jack's lips curled into a wicked smile, one that sent a chill down David's spine. "Destroy?" Jack scoffed, taking a step toward him. "I'm not destroying anything, David. I'm rebuilding. You see, this town is broken. People like you, weak, complacent. You're what's wrong with it. I'm fixing that." His eyes narrowed. "And I'm starting with you." Before David could respond, one of Jack's men, Mike, the burly leader of the gang, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You really think you can stop us, old man? You and your little sidekick?" He glared at Grace, who stood her ground beside David, her eyes unwavering. David felt the rising tension. but he remained calm. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he met Jack's eyes again, his expression resolute. "This ends tonight, Jack. You know it. I know it." Jack's face twisted into a dark smile. "Oh, I know. But what you don't understand is that I've already won. You were never enough to stop me, and now you'll be just another lesson to the people who follow me." He raised a hand, signaling to his men to prepare. David tensed, his muscles coiled for what was to come. But even as the gang members started to circle, ready for a fight, David wasn't focused on them. His attention was entirely on Jack, the man who had once been his comrade, his brother in arms, and now stood as his enemy. Jack lunged at David, his movement swift and precise, a knife gleaming in his hand. David sidestepped, barely avoiding the blade. The warehouse seemed to close in on him, the clang of boots on the metal floor ringing in his ears. He grabbed Jack's wrist mid-swing, twisting it violently until the knife fell to the ground with a metallic clatter. Jack let out a low growl, twisting out of David's grip with surprising speed. "You think you've won, David?" he sneered, backing up a few steps to give himself space. "You've always been too soft. That's why you couldn't stop me before?" David didn't answer. He didn't need to. His body was already reacting to the rhythm of the fight. He was quicker than Jack now, faster, more focused. Jack's wild swings didn't have the precision they once had. David moved with the controlled grace of a man who had been in combat long enough to know how to survive. Jack lunged again, his knife flashing toward David's side. But David caught the blow with his forearm, gritting his teeth against the pain. The sharp sting of the blade cutting into his flesh was a reminder of just how far Jack had fallen. But David wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let Jack destroy everything he had fought for. In one swift motion, David grabbed Jack's wrist and twisted it again, this time forcing him to the ground. Jack grunted in pain, struggling to free himself, but David was relentless, pinning him down with ease. "Jack," David said, his voice low and filled with regret, "you don't have to do this. You were a good man once. But now, this is your legacy?" Jack's eyes burned with fury, but there was something else in them too. Fear, recognition. He could see now that David wasn't just an old man with memories of past wars. He was a soldier, a survivor, and he had the strength to end this. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Jack spat, his face contorted with anger. "You're just a ghost, David. You always were. Weak, pathetic." David's grip tightened. "I'm not the ghost, Jack. You are." At that moment, David felt a sharp pain in his side. Mike had slipped behind him and driven a knife into his ribs. David grunted but didn't release his hold on Jack. He had to finish this. The pain would have to wait. Grace, ever the fighter, was at David's side in an instant, knocking Mike off balance with a swift kick to the chest. She grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it with precision, catching Mike square in the jaw. He staggered back, dazed, his knife falling to the floor. David, using the opportunity, shoved Jack off him and rose to his feet. Blood dripped from his side, but he was still standing, still ready to fight. "Grace, stay back," he gritted out, his voice rough with pain. But she didn't listen. She stood beside him, holding the pipe in a defensive stance. "We're in this together," she said, her eyes fierce. David glanced back at Jack, who was now scrambling to his feet, rage flooding his features. "You should have stayed out of it, David," Jack growled. "You never understood what we were building. We were going to change things. You were just too weak to see it." David's eyes narrowed as Jack lunged once more. This time, David was ready. He sidestepped again, using Jack's momentum against him. In a fluid motion, he grabbed Jack's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground. The sound of bones cracking under pressure was sharp and unmistakable. Jack screamed in pain, but David didn't stop. He turned Jack over, pinning him to the floor as his breath came in short, ragged bursts. "You're done, Jack," David said, his voice heavy with the weight of the past and the anger of the present. "This town belongs to the people, not to you, not to your hate." Jack's eyes, once full of defiance, were now wide with fear. You don't understand, David. You don't know what I've built." David shook his head. "I understand more than you think, and it ends now." He reached for the zip ties in his pocket and secured Jack's wrists. Jack struggled briefly, but there was no fight left in him. The fight had gone out of him the moment he had realized that David was no longer the man he could manipulate. With Jack secured, David stood up, his side throbbing with pain. Grace was by his side in an instant, her eyes searching his face. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. David nodded, though the pain was evident in his expression. "I'll live. Let's get him out of here." The sirens blared in the distance, growing louder as David and Grace made their way through the warehouse, keeping a close watch on the subdued Jack. His men, who had initially seemed so confident, were now scattered and subdued, most of them lying on the cold concrete floor, with their hands zip-tied behind their backs. The once dominant force had crumbled in the face of David's determination and the unexpected assistance of Grace. As they approached the exit, David's side throbbed with pain, the wound from Mike's knife still fresh. The blood had slowed, but the discomfort was enough to make him grimace with each step. He could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in as well, but there was no time to rest, not yet. "We need to move fast," David said, his voice strained. He shot a glance at Grace, who was still holding the metal pipe, her face a mask of quiet determination. "The police will be here soon. We can't let them slip away." Grace nodded, glancing over her shoulder at the scattered gang members. "You're right. But what about Jack?" she asked, her voice steady but concerned. David gave her a quick, reassuring look. "We take him to the sheriff. He's the key. He's the one who's been pulling the strings, orchestrating everything. If we stop him, the rest will fall apart." They reached the door to the warehouse, the faint sound of sirens growing louder, closer. As David pushed open the door, he was met with the cool night air, which brought a brief sense of relief from the stifling atmosphere of the warehouse. Grace stepped out ahead of him, scanning the streets for any signs of danger. The police cruisers appeared around the corner, their lights flashing brightly in the dim street. Several officers piled out, their hands on their weapons as they moved toward the warehouse. When they saw David and Grace standing beside Jack, a tense moment of silence passed before the officers recognized David. "David!" One of the officers, a familiar face from town, called out. "What's going on here?" David raised a hand, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "These men were planning to burn this town down. Jack Evans is behind it all. He's been organizing attacks across Miller's Creek." The officer's eyes widened as he processed the information. "Jack Evans? The same Jack from your unit?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. David nodded grimly. "The very same." Sheriff Carter arrived a few moments later, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. He had a deep respect for David, but tonight, that respect was tempered with a hard edge, the weight of what had been done hanging in the air between them. "What happened here?" Sheriff Carter asked, his eyes flicking between David and the subdued gang members. David took a deep breath, his hand pressed against his side to staunch the bleeding. "It's over, Sheriff. Jack and his men are finished, but the damage they've done, it's not going to be undone overnight." Carter nodded slowly, his expression hardening as he walked closer to Jack, who was still lying on the ground restrained. "We'll take it from here, David. We'll make sure he and his crew are dealt with." David's gaze was unwavering as he looked at Jack, who met his eyes with a mixture of defiance and fear. There was no more bravado in Jack's posture. The man who had once been a leader, someone David had trusted, was now nothing more than a coward who had manipulated his followers for his own twisted vision of strength. David's jaw tightened as he spoke again, his words low but full of conviction. "This town was never yours to control, Jack. You thought you could take it by force, but you underestimated the people here. You underestimated me." Jack's lips twisted into a snarl. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "You can't stop what's already been set in motion. You never understood what I was building." David shook his head, his eyes never leaving Jack's. "I understand perfectly, and I'm going to make sure your legacy ends tonight." The officers moved in, cuffing Jack and his men as they carefully loaded them into the police cruisers. The weight of the situation didn't escape David. He had been fighting for this moment for far too long. Jack's reign of terror was over, but the scars left behind would take longer to heal. "Are you all right?" Grace asked, her voice gentle as she touched David's arm. He glanced at her, his face softened by the concern in her eyes. "I'll be fine. It's just a scratch." Grace didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she gave him a quiet nod. "You've done it, David. You stopped him." David sighed, his chest tight with exhaustion. "We stopped him," he corrected softly, glancing toward the horizon. The first light of dawn was beginning to break, casting a faint glow over the town. But this town still has a long way to go. The sheriff stood beside them, his eyes scanning the scene. "We'll have to rebuild, David. Not just the town, but the trust that was broken. There's a lot of people who'll need help picking up the pieces after all this." David nodded silently, his gaze shifting back to the police cars as they pulled away, with Jack and his men in tow. He had done what needed to be done, but the fight wasn't over. The memories of the chaos, the lives ruined, the fear that had gripped the town, it would stay with him. But for now, the worst was behind them. "Where do we go from here?" Grace asked quietly, as the sound of the departing police vehicles faded into the distance. David took a deep breath, his eyes steady as he looked out over the town that had become his home. "We start rebuilding, one piece at a time." The sun was fully risen now, casting golden light over Miller's Creek. The faint scent of smoke still lingered in the air from the fires the gang had set. But there was something else now, something that David hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The town, though scarred by the violence of the past few days, was still standing. The people were still here, and they were beginning to rebuild. David sat on a weathered bench near the town square, the quiet hum of the morning bustling around him. The police had taken Jack and his men into custody, but the work wasn't over. Now came the healing, the slow, steady process of rebuilding, not just the physical damage, but the trust and unity that had been shattered. Grace approached, her footsteps light as she sat down beside him. She had that familiar warmth in her eyes, but there was a tiredness to her that wasn't there before. The town had been through so much, and so had they. "I've been talking to some of the people in town," Grace said softly, her eyes scanning the street where families were already beginning to clear debris from burned homes. "They're scared, David, but they're also relieved. They're ready to rebuild." David nodded, his gaze distant. "It's not going to be easy. What Jack did, the fear he spread, it doesn't just go away. People need time to process all of this, and some of them might never fully recover. But they'll try," Grace said, a note of hope in her voice. "The important thing is, they're not giving up. They're standing together. That's what matters." David let out a quiet sigh, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I don't think I realized how much this town needed something to bring it together. All this time, I've been fighting for something. But it's not just about fighting. It's about standing strong together as a community. That's what we've got here." Grace smiled softly, reaching out to place her hand on his. "And you gave them that strength, David. You stood up when it mattered. You didn't just save the town, you gave them the chance to be strong again." David shook his head, a wry smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I didn't do it alone. I had help." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about me, right?" David chuckled softly, his expression softening as he turned to face her. "You were a lot more help than you think. This town wouldn't have stood a chance if you weren't there. You kept me grounded when I thought I couldn't do it anymore." Grace's smile widened. "Well, someone had to remind you that not all battles are fought alone." David's heart felt lighter than it had in years. It wasn't just the victory over Jack, though that had been a major moment. It was the way the town had come together, the way the people of Miller's Creek had chosen to fight back, not with violence, but with unity. That was the true victory. He had known the value of brotherhood on the battlefield, but now he was seeing it play out in a way he hadn't expected. A town that had been fractured by fear, hatred, and division was slowly healing. And in that healing, David found a sense of peace. The weight of his past, his experiences, and the scars that had defined him for so long were starting to fade, replaced by something else. Hope. "We still have work to do," David said, his voice low but resolute. "There are still people who will need our help. We've got to make sure that this never happens again." Grace nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the town square. "We'll do it together, one step at a time." David stood, his knees creaking slightly as he stretched, but the movement felt good. Grace followed him, and together they walked down the street, passing by the buildings that had been burned to the ground by Jack's gang. The damage was still evident, but there were signs of recovery. People were clearing rubble, fixing windows, and comforting one another. It was a slow process, but there was a determination in their steps that couldn't be denied. The sound of hammers hitting nails and people talking, working together, was a symphony of healing in its own right. It was a sign that the town wasn't broken, despite what had happened. It had been tested, yes, but it wasn't defeated. Miller's Creek would come back stronger. David and Grace stopped at the town's cafe, the place where it had all started. The door jingled as they entered, and the familiar smell of coffee and fresh pastries filled the air. Grace went behind the counter and began wiping it down. Her movements slow but deliberate, as if she were still processing everything that had happened. David slid onto one of the stools, his thoughts drifting for a moment. He had spent so many years focused on survival, on the next mission, the next battle, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about what came after, what it all meant. But now, with Miller's Creek on the road to recovery, he felt like the pieces were starting to fall into place. Maybe he didn't need to fight anymore. Maybe it was time for him to rebuild, just like the town. Grace set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him, her expression softer than it had been before. "David," she said, her voice quieter now, "you gave this town a chance. You showed them that there's something worth fighting for." David took a sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. "It wasn't just me," he said, his voice steady. "It was everyone, the town, the people. They stood up too." Grace smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "Maybe, but you were the one who made them believe they could." He didn't respond. Instead, he just nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had given everything he had to this fight, his past, his strength, his heart. But now it was time for something new. The fight had been hard, but it had taught him more than just how to survive. It had taught him the importance of community, of standing together, and of finding hope even in the darkest of times. The town would heal. He would heal. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he could breathe again. The cafe was quiet for a moment as they sat together, the sound of the coffee machine humming softly in the background. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, and the people of Miller's Creek were beginning to rebuild, one step at a time. David stood up from the stool, his body still aching from the events of the past few days. But the ache was different now. It wasn't the ache of regret or guilt. It was the ache of a man who had fought for something and now knew that it was worth it. Grace followed him to the door. As he opened it, he paused for a moment, looking out at the town. The work was far from over, but the worst was behind them. "We'll do it right this time, Grace," David said, his voice steady and firm. "We'll rebuild, together." She smiled, stepping outside beside him. Together. As the two of them walked down the street side by side, David felt a quiet satisfaction. He had faced his past, confronted the man who had betrayed everything he once believed in, and now he was walking into the future, one that was full of possibility. He didn't know what that future would hold, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face it. The sun rose higher in the sky, and as the people of Miller's Creek worked together, David couldn't help but believe that there was something to be learned from this battle, something bigger than just survival, something about hope, redemption, and the power of unity. And maybe, just maybe, the fight for peace in this small town had only just begun.